It was supposed to be routine, a quiet archival review, no headlines, no revelations. But deep inside sealed palace records, a senior historian uncovered something that stopped everything cold: a hidden amendment to Prince Philip's will, deliberately buried, deliberately ignored. And at the center of it all was one name the palace never expected to be questioned again: Camilla. This wasn't a rumor. It was a document, and it was never meant to be found. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The discovery unfolded without ceremony, which made it all the more dangerous. One file out of place, one notation that didn't align, a margin reference that led nowhere until it led somewhere it shouldn't. The historian knew immediately this wasn't an oversight. Palace records are curated with precision, omissions engineered with intent. This amendment had been placed just far enough out of reach to avoid casual discovery, yet preserved well enough to be enforced if needed. That contradiction alone raised alarms. What followed was hesitation. Not doubt about authenticity, but fear of consequence. The historian understood the gravity instantly. This was not a historical curiosity. It was a live wire. Prince Philip's will had already been presented to the world as settled, complete, final. An amendment implied revision. Revision implied motive. And motive, in a palace context, is never benign. The name it referenced, Camilla, transformed the find from archival anomaly into institutional threat. Inside palace circles, word spread quickly and quietly. Phones were not used. Meetings were informal but urgent. The reaction was not confusion. It was recognition. Recognition that this document had been anticipated, discussed, and intentionally sidelined. The immediate concern wasn't whether it was real, but whether it could remain contained. Long-set assumptions about authority, legacy, and the boundaries Philip intended suddenly looked fragile. The historian paused before reporting it formally, not out of uncertainty, but responsibility. This was the kind of finding that rewrites context retroactively. Decisions made since Philip's death would now be viewed through a different lens. Silences would become suspicious. Delays would look strategic. And the palace's long insistence that everything had been transparent would collapse under the weight of one buried page. Early signs of concealment became impossible to ignore. Cross-references that ended abruptly. Correspondence logged but never circulated. Annotations acknowledging receipt without acknowledgement of content. This wasn't negligence. It was design. Someone had decided this amendment should exist without being seen, preserved without being spoken, powerful without being public. That decision suggested fear not of scandal, but of consequence. As the historian pieced together the context, the shape of the story sharpened. This amendment wasn't added in haste or anger. It was calculated, timed, written with the understanding that it might surface one day, but not until the institution was forced to confront it. That realization reframed everything. This wasn't a secret accidentally uncovered. It was a secret waiting. And once found, it could not be unfound. The document's existence alone altered the balance, even before its contents were fully absorbed. The palace had spent years controlling the narrative of Philip's final wishes. Now, a single amendment threatened to fracture that control at its foundation. But to understand why this document was hidden, we must first understand who Prince Philip truly was behind palace walls. Publicly, Prince Philip stood one step behind the crown. Privately, his influence shaped everything. Decisions were weighed against his approval. Traditions were preserved by his insistence. And when it came to legacy, Philip believed silence was as powerful as command. His will was never just about inheritance, it was about control, even after death. Behind palace walls, Philip was not a figurehead. He was a constant presence, a quiet force whose opinions carried consequence long after conversations ended. Senior figures understood this instinctively. Proposals were softened before reaching him. Ambitions were measured against his likely response. He had little patience for theatrics and even less for what he considered unnecessary disruption. Stability, to Philip, was not a vague ideal, it was a discipline, something that had to be actively defended from erosion. His concern for the institution ran deeper than ceremony. Philip saw the monarchy as a structure that survived only through restraint and internal order. He believed loyalty was proven through action, not proximity, and hierarchy existed for a reason. Those who respected it preserved continuity. Those who challenged it risked fracture. These beliefs informed every private judgment he made, especially when he sensed ambition moving faster than consensus. Legacy, for Philip, was never sentimental. It was strategic. He understood that public narratives change, but internal documents endure. His will was crafted with that understanding, carrying not just personal instructions but institutional signals. It was designed to guide behavior, to clarify limits, to ensure that decisions made after his death still aligned with the principles he believed kept the monarchy intact. In that sense, the will functioned less as a personal document and more as a final memorandum. Philip's distrust of unchecked ambition was well known among those closest to him. He had witnessed how entitlement, when left unchallenged, could destabilize even the strongest systems. Ambition without restraint, in his view, invited conflict and weakened legitimacy. That skepticism shaped how he assessed roles, recognition, and influence. He believed authority had to be earned continuously, not assumed once granted. This perspective explains why Philip planned beyond his lifetime. He did not trust that silence alone would preserve order, yet he understood that overt instruction could provoke resistance. So he chose precision. He believed that the most effective guidance was the kind discovered too late to argue with, too clearly written to dismiss. His planning was quiet, deliberate, and insulated from immediate reaction. Those who worked closely with Philip understood that his greatest interventions were often invisible. He preferred to correct course subtly, to leave markers rather than mandates. That approach allowed the institution to adjust without appearing fractured. It also ensured that his influence would linger, shaping outcomes long after his voice was no longer heard in meetings. Seen through that lens, the existence of a hidden amendment becomes less surprising and far more revealing. It aligns perfectly with Philip's worldview: act decisively, leave no ambiguity, and trust the document to speak when the moment demands it. He did not believe in dramatic exits. He believed in enduring consequences. That long-range thinking explains why one amendment was quietly added and never meant to be read aloud. The amendment was brief, clinical, and devastating. It didn't rewrite the will, it clarified it, and in doing so, it revealed intentions that contradicted everything the public believed. What Prince Philip added in those final pages wasn't emotional, it was strategic. And it directly addressed Camilla in a way the palace had worked tirelessly to obscure. At first glance, the amendment appeared almost unremarkable. No dramatic language, no personal grievances, just a small insertion that shifted meaning rather than structure. But that was precisely what made it so dangerous. Where the original will outlined distributions and protections in broad terms, the amendment narrowed interpretation. It didn't take anything away outright, it defined boundaries. And in royal documents, boundaries are everything. The language was precise enough to raise immediate alarms, phrases that emphasized limitation rather than entitlement. References to authority being conditional, not assumed. Responsibilities described in terms of permission rather than position. Nothing explicit enough to spark public scandal, yet unmistakable to anyone familiar with palace mechanics. This was Philip speaking in code, the kind of code meant only for those who understood how power truly operates inside the monarchy. Camilla's name was never written plainly, but it didn't need to be. The context made the reference unmistakable. The amendment spoke of roles assumed after succession and recognition not exceeding defined scope. It was careful, deliberate wording that pointed in one direction only. Those who read it understood immediately who it applied to and why it had to be framed this way. Philip wasn't issuing a rebuke. He was issuing a constraint. The timing of the amendment deepened its significance. It was added late, after years of observation, after Philip had watched relationships evolve and ambitions settle into expectation. This was not a reactionary move. It was a calculated adjustment made when Philip believed the risk had matured enough to require intervention. He waited until the moment when the amendment would matter most and be hardest to ignore. There were clear signs it was meant for internal enforcement, not public consumption. The amendment referenced protocols known only to senior courtiers. It relied on interpretations that would never surface in a press release. It functioned as a guide for those tasked with maintaining balance after Philip's death. In effect, it was a message to the institution, not the public, a final instruction disguised as clarification. Its existence changes royal narratives because it reframes years of behavior that once seemed ambiguous. Hesitations now look intentional. Limits now look enforced. Resistance that was dismissed as personality conflict suddenly appears rooted in instruction. The amendment doesn't create a new story, it exposes the one that's been operating quietly in the background all along. Most unsettling of all is how calmly it does this. There is no drama in the text, no moralizing, just a steady assertion of principle. Philip trusted the system to read between the lines, to act without spectacle, and to preserve the illusion of unity while applying restraint where needed. That trust explains why the amendment could sit unseen for so long, and why its discovery now is so destabilizing. Once the name was understood, the implications became impossible to contain. This wasn't a personal rebuke. It was a structural warning. Prince Philip's amendment did not remove Camilla, but it defined her limits. Limits the palace has never acknowledged publicly. Limits that now explain years of tension, hesitation, and quiet resistance. The document didn't question her presence. It questioned her authority. What the amendment accomplished was subtle and devastating. It reframed Camilla's role not as an expanding center of influence, but as a contained position bound by conditions. Where public narratives spoke of progression and inevitability, Philip's language spoke of restraint. Authority, as defined in the amendment, was not automatic. It was contingent. It existed within parameters that were never meant to be tested openly, yet were designed to be enforced silently. Those restrictions were implied rather than declared, which is precisely why they endured. Philip understood the mechanics of the palace too well to issue blunt prohibitions. Instead, he wrote limits that relied on interpretation by those who already knew the rules. Senior courtiers, private secretaries, and institutional guardians would recognize the signal immediately. The amendment didn't need to name consequences. It relied on tradition to supply them. Suddenly, years of confusing palace behavior began to make sense. Delayed acknowledgements, carefully staged appearances, authority that seemed present but never fully activated, resistance that was dismissed publicly as personality clashes now appears procedural. The amendment explains why certain doors never fully opened, why influence plateaued rather than advanced, and why enthusiasm behind closed doors never matched the confidence presented outwardly. If made public, the emotional fallout would be explosive, not because it would reveal animosity, but because it would expose contradiction. The palace has spent years projecting unity and settled hierarchy. This document would undermine that image, revealing a carefully managed balance where public symbolism masked private limitation. It would force uncomfortable questions about who knew, who enforced it, and who benefited from keeping it quiet. The conflict with Camilla's current standing is impossible to ignore. Publicly, her role appears consolidated. Privately, Philip's amendment suggests it was always provisional. That tension between what is seen and what is sanctioned creates instability. It places Camilla in a position where authority exists outwardly but remains contested internally. That is the most precarious kind of power to hold. Philip felt this clarification was necessary because he anticipated exactly this moment. He foresaw a future where assumptions would harden into entitlement and where silence could be mistaken for consent. His amendment was not an act of hostility, it was an act of prevention. A safeguard designed to preserve institutional balance when personalities threatened to pull it off center. What makes the amendment so confrontational is its calm. There is no accusation, no emotional language, no moral judgment, just boundaries. Boundaries that do not argue they exist. And once discovered, they demand acknowledgement. The document forces the palace to confront a truth it has managed quietly for years, that authority was never as unconditional as it appeared. The amendment didn't weaken Camilla by removing her. It weakened assumptions by exposing limits, and in doing so, it revealed how much of the monarchy's recent history has been shaped not by open agreement, but by quiet enforcement of rules never meant to be seen. But the amendment didn't exist in isolation, it collided with long-standing internal divisions. Documents don't bury themselves. For years, this amendment sat untouched, unseen, and unspoken, because powerful figures ensured it stayed that way. The historian's discovery raised a more dangerous question. Who knew, and why was silence enforced? The answer points to a quiet conspiracy of protection and avoidance at the highest level. Access to Prince Philip's will was never casual. Only a narrow circle ever saw its full contents, and an even smaller group understood the implications of the amendment tucked within it. These were not junior clerks or distant archivists. They were senior custodians of continuity, individuals entrusted with safeguarding stability, reputation, and order. They knew exactly what the amendment suggested, and more importantly, what acknowledging it would disrupt. Its exclusion from public probate records was not an administrative oversight. It was a calculated omission. The will presented to the public was clean, settled, and uncontroversial by design. Introducing an amendment, especially one that reframed authority, would have invited scrutiny the palace was not prepared to manage. It would have forced explanations where silence had long sufficed. So the amendment remained internal, preserved but invisible, protected by process and discretion. Releasing it earlier carried significant risk. At the time of Philip's passing, the monarchy was navigating a fragile transition. Public confidence mattered, unity mattered. Any suggestion that Philip had imposed limits or conditions particularly involving Camilla would have fractured the narrative of cohesion the palace worked tirelessly to maintain. Those tasked with managing the moment chose containment over transparency, believing stability justified suppression. Inside palace walls, disagreement simmered quietly. Not everyone believed the amendment should remain buried. Some viewed it as a guiding document, meant to inform decisions precisely when ambiguity threatened balance. Others saw it as too dangerous, too easily misinterpreted if exposed. These disagreements never reached the surface. They were settled the palace way through delay, deferral, and eventual silence. Over time, that silence hardened into policy. The amendment became something known but not discussed, a reference point without a voice. Decisions were made with it in mind, yet never attributed to it. This allowed the institution to benefit from Philip's constraints without ever admitting they existed. It was governance by implication, enforcement without acknowledgement. The cost of keeping it hidden was cumulative. Each year of silence widened the gap between public perception and internal reality. Authority appeared consolidated while remaining quietly conditional. Confidence was projected while caution ruled behind closed doors. The longer the amendment stayed buried, the more explosive its discovery became. What might once have been absorbed as clarification now threatens to be seen as concealment. The historian's discovery shattered that arrangement. It removed the option of quiet management and replaced it with urgency. Once a document is found, it demands context. Once context emerges, Accountability follows. Those who enforced silence now face the prospect of explaining why it existed at all and whether they acted to protect the institution or themselves. What emerges is not a single villain, but a system trained to prioritize survival through discretion. Yet, discretion has limits. When secrets outlive their usefulness, they become liabilities. The amendment crossed that line the moment it was rediscovered, transforming from a buried safeguard into a catalyst for reckoning. That silence, however, was never guaranteed to last. This discovery didn't happen in a vacuum. It surfaced at the worst possible time for the palace. Internal power struggles, shifting loyalties, and growing scrutiny created the perfect storm. When the amendment resurfaced, it wasn't just history being uncovered, it was leverage entering the room. Timing is everything inside the monarchy, and this timing could not have been more dangerous. Authority was already being renegotiated behind closed doors. Roles were being reassessed. Lines of influence that once felt stable had begun to blur. Into that uncertainty dropped a document that didn't just clarify the past, it threatened to dictate the future. The amendment arrived like a pressure point, capable of tipping already fragile balances with a single acknowledgement. Fractures within royal authority were no longer theoretical. They were active. Competing visions for continuity had been quietly colliding, and patience was thinning. In that environment, the resurfacing of Philip's amendment felt less like coincidence and more like inevitability. It gave form to tensions that had been difficult to articulate and dangerous to confront. Suddenly, unspoken resistance had language, hesitation had justification. For the historian, the dilemma became intensely personal. To suppress the document meant becoming part of the machinery that had hidden it in the first place. To reveal it meant triggering consequences far beyond academic responsibility. This was no longer about record-keeping. It was about intervention. The weight of that choice was suffocating, because either path would alter lives, reputations, and the direction of the institution itself. Pressure came from both sides. Some urged restraint, arguing that reopening Philip's intentions would destabilize an already delicate moment. Others insisted that continued suppression would only compound the damage when the truth inevitably surfaced. The historian stood at the center of that conflict, fully aware that once the amendment entered broader discussion, control would evaporate. The palace could manage silence. It could not manage revelation. What made the amendment so powerful was its ability to influence decisions without being officially acknowledged. Senior figures understood that its mere existence could be cited privately to justify resistance, delay, or recalibration. It could shape outcomes without ever being named publicly. That made it a weapon as much as a document, one capable of altering trajectories quietly and decisively. The fear of precedent loomed largest. If this amendment were acknowledged, it would invite questions about what else had been withheld, managed, or delayed in the name of stability. It would challenge the assumption that legacy documents are settled truths rather than living instruments. And once that door opened, it could not be closed. The monarchy would be forced to confront not just Philip's final intentions, but its own methods of control. As whispers began to circulate, even the most disciplined efforts at containment started to crack. Curiosity spread. Interpretations multiplied. The amendment became more dangerous with every passing hour, not because of what it said, but because of who was beginning to ask about it. Silence, once effective, now felt conspicuous. The palace had navigated crises before, but this was different. This was not an external threat. It was an internal reckoning, resurfacing at a moment when authority was already under negotiation. The amendment did not create the storm. It exposed it and threatened to steer it. And once whispers began, containment was no longer possible. One document can rewrite an entire balance of power. Philip's amendment does exactly that. It reframes authority, validates long-held resistance, and undermines assumptions that were treated as settled. What was once dismissed as tension now looks like strategy delayed by time. The immediate effect of the amendment is empowerment quiet, calculated empowerment for those who had been cautious all along. Senior royals who resisted accelerating recognition, who insisted on process over momentum, now find their instincts vindicated. What they framed as prudence can now be defended as adherence to Philip's intent. The amendment becomes a shield, allowing restraint to be enforced without appearing obstructive. It gives legitimacy to hesitation, and in a system built on consensus, that legitimacy is decisive. At the same time, others suddenly look exposed. Authority that relied on assumption rather than instruction now appears vulnerable. Positions once treated as inevitable are revealed to be conditional, dependent on interpretations that no longer hold unquestioned weight. The amendment does not accuse, but it destabilizes by implication. It invites scrutiny where certainty once lived, and scrutiny, inside the palace, is corrosive to unchecked influence. For Camilla, the risk is long-term and structural. The amendment does not remove her role, but it reframes its ceiling. That reframing introduces doubt into future planning. Influence that cannot expand must consolidate, and consolidation invites resistance. The more the amendment is acknowledged internally, the more her standing becomes something to be negotiated rather than assumed. That shift alone alters how alliances form and how decisions are timed. Institutionally, acknowledgement of the amendment would force a reckoning. It would confirm that legacy documents are not ceremonial relics, but active instruments of governance. That realization changes how the monarchy treats its own history. It means past intentions can override present narratives. It means continuity is not merely inherited, but curated, enforced through documents designed to outlive personalities. Legacy documents have always controlled the present, but rarely so visibly. Philip's amendment proves that influence does not end with tenure. It migrates into text, into guidance meant to be discovered when conditions demand it. The monarchy is built to absorb that kind of control, but not without friction. Each acknowledgement tightens constraints and narrows options, forcing adaptation rather than performance. Internal negotiations change immediately under this pressure. Discussions that once leaned on precedent must now contend with instruction. Arguments based on tradition are weighed against clarification. The amendment introduces a new variable into every calculation, not what has been done, but what was intended to be allowed. That distinction shifts leverage dramatically. Those aligned with the amendment gain quiet authority. Those misaligned must recalibrate or resist. What makes this destabilizing is its permanence. The amendment cannot be argued away without dismissing Philip himself. It cannot be ignored without consequence. And it cannot be selectively applied without revealing bias. It sits at the center of internal debate, reshaping outcomes even when unspoken. Power begins to move differently, not loudly, but decisively. The longer the amendment remains part of the internal landscape, the more it restructures behavior. Ambition slows. Caution gains value. Silence becomes strategic again, but this time under watchful awareness. The monarchy adjusts not because it wants to, but because it must. Philip's final clarification does not demand obedience, it creates inevitability. But the most unsettling impact lies not in the past, but in what happens next. If Philip's hidden amendment becomes public, the monarchy won't just face embarrassment, it will face a reckoning. Every decision made since his death would be re-examined. Every silence questioned. Every authority challenged. This isn't a scandal waiting to break. It's a structural fault line waiting to split open. The public reaction would be immediate and unforgiving. Not because the amendment is dramatic in tone, but because it contradicts the story people were told. Trust, once shaken, does not fracture cleanly, it splinters. Questions would flood in from every direction. Why was this hidden? Who decided it didn't matter? And how many decisions were shaped by something the public was never meant to see? The monarchy's greatest vulnerability has always been credibility, and this would strike directly at its core. Media scrutiny would be relentless. Not tabloid frenzy, but sustained institutional interrogation. Every appearance, every delay, every carefully worded statement from the past would be recontextualized. Journalists would no longer be chasing rumors, they would be dissecting timelines. Silence, once dismissed as discretion, would be reframed as strategy. The palace would find itself defending not one decision, but an entire pattern of behavior. Inside the institution, the fallout would be even more destabilizing. Senior figures would be forced to confront whether continued suppression was still defensible. The moral dilemma would sharpen quickly: protect the image at the cost of truth, or acknowledge the truth at the cost of control. Either choice carries damage. Suppression would now look like deception. Disclosure would look like admission. There is no safe ground once the amendment enters public consciousness. The legal consequences may be limited, but the symbolic consequences would be profound. The amendment does not overturn succession or invalidate titles, yet symbolism is the monarchy's lifeblood. To reveal that a senior figure's authority was internally constrained would invite public reassessment of legitimacy. Legal structures may survive intact, but perception would not. And perception, in a constitutional monarchy, is power. For Camilla, the impact would be deeply personal and permanently structural. Her legitimacy would not vanish overnight, but it would be questioned in a way it never has before. The amendment would frame her role as conditional rather than consolidated, and that distinction would follow her relentlessly. Every action would be measured against Philip's intent. Every assertion weighed against a document she never publicly answered for. This is why the palace fears this revelation more than any scandal. Scandals burn fast and fade. This would linger. It would reshape narratives, embolden critics, and validate long-suspected tensions. It would suggest that the monarchy's internal order has been far more fragile and far more managed than anyone was meant to know. Worst of all, it would confirm that even after death, Prince Philip was still shaping outcomes. What makes the situation truly apocalyptic is that there would be no clean resolution. No apology could undo the years of silence. No clarification could fully explain why the amendment was buried. Once public, it would exist as a permanent reference point, a reminder that power inside the palace does not always operate in daylight. The institution could survive the revelation, but it would not emerge unchanged. Because Prince Philip's final intervention may still be unfolding. Prince Philip always believed duty outlived the individual. With one hidden amendment, he ensured his influence would linger long after his passing. What the palace tried to bury has returned not as memory, but as consequence. The question now is no longer what Philip intended, but whether the monarchy can continue pretending it doesn't matter. Philip's legacy was never that of a spectator. He was an architect, shaping outcomes through structure rather than spectacle. He understood that power survives not by noise, but by design. The amendment stands as proof of that philosophy, a final mechanism inserted quietly, meant to activate when circumstance demanded it. In that sense, Philip did not leave the monarchy. He embedded himself within it, ensuring his principles would surface precisely when they were needed most. This revelation changes how history will judge him, not merely as consort, not merely as guardian of tradition, but as strategist. The amendment reframes his final years as purposeful, watchful, and corrective. It suggests that Philip saw fractures forming and chose preparation over confrontation. Rather than argue in life, he planned in silence, trusting the institution to eventually encounter his intent and reckon with it. With that encounter comes the quiet end of controlled narratives. For years, the palace managed perception through omission and emphasis, smoothing over complexities in the name of stability. The amendment disrupts that balance. It introduces an unfiltered voice from the past, one that cannot be spun or negotiated with. Once acknowledged, It strips away the comfort of selective memory and replaces it with accountability. Legacy documents have always held this power, but rarely so starkly. They override time by anchoring intention in text. They wait patiently while personalities change and circumstances evolve. Philip's amendment demonstrates that such documents do not fade, they mature. When they resurface, they do so with authority earned through restraint. That is what makes this moment so chilling. The past has reasserted itself with precision. For Camilla, the implications are inescapable. Her future is now shadowed by a clarification she never publicly answered. The amendment does not condemn her, but it confines her, placing boundaries where momentum once suggested expansion. Every step forward will now be measured against a standard she did not set, but must live within. That constraint will shape not just perception, but possibility. Ultimately, this may be Philip's final word, not spoken, but enforced. A reminder that duty does not dissolve with death, and that institutions remember what individuals would prefer to forget. The monarchy now stands at a crossroads between acknowledgement and denial, between adapting to truth or resisting it until resistance becomes untenable. The amendment has done its work simply by existing, because some secrets are not meant to stay buried, and when they rise, they reshape everything. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.